Robin Zander, scene A1.
I'm Robin Zander, and this is Snafu. Today, my guest is Rebecca Hinds. Rebecca is the author, the new best-selling author of Your Best Meeting Ever: 7 Principles for Designing Meetings That Get Things Done. In this wide-ranging conversation, Rebecca and I talk about meeting culture and where meetings go poorly and how to do them better. We talked about tactics and tools to design meetings, but also work more broadly to do work that doesn't suck and hopefully, ideally, some of the best work of our lives. Rebecca founded the Work Innovation Lab at Asana, the work management software, and now leads the Work AI Institute at Glean. We talk about becoming a Division I swimmer at Stanford, where she did her undergraduate, master's, and PhD work in organizational behavior. And we also talk about her writing process and the work that went into researching and writing this book. I hope you enjoy this wide-ranging conversation with Rebecca Hinds, the author of Your Best Meeting Ever. Rebecca, thank you for coming on the podcast today.
Thanks so much for having me, Robin.
First of all, congratulations on hitting some exciting lists with the launch of the new book. You have hit some bestseller numbers.
Thank you. Yes, the USA Today list came out this week, so that was exciting and something that I had hoped for, but wasn't the end-all be-all, but it's a nice cherry on top.
That's great. When I read the book from the very beginning, the first thing that came to mind was actually the Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman novel, Good Omens. I've never shared this before, I think in any context, but there's a scene in that book where there's a demon Crowley who is talking about how he designed a specific freeway in the UK. I had looked it up in prep for the interview, and it was the M25. With like delicious deviance in mind to cause as much havoc and like difficulty for people driving as possible. And it's actually been a touch point in myself and in my life where I think it was Cory Doctorow just came out with a book, The Inshitification was the title, right? And it's this idea of like things get progressively worse over time. Technology, specifically consumer-facing technology, gets prioritized for the companies and the owners of those technologies, not you and me as the consumer. But like, what are the things in our lives that get progressively worse over time? And just like this, fictitious demon Crowley designed freeways to make miserable the life of people driving on the freeways as an agent of hell. I really loved your framing of meetings as, if you don't look out for this, this is going to become something that not only you dread, but is extremely time-consuming, taxing, and draining for everybody involved.
And that's, the book opens with that simple sabotage field manual written by the Office of Strategic Services, which was the precursor to the CIA. And, they were advising back in World War II, if you were an ordinary citizen living in enemy territory, you could use meetings as this weapon of mass dysfunction. And, it's ironic, it's sad, it's unfortunate that what was once advocated as a weapon of sabotage is now business as usual. And we feel it. We know that if we were designing meetings from scratch with no biases, no preconceptions, there's no way we would design them how they're designed today. But the problem is, as humans, change is hard, and meetings have so many innate human tendencies that make them dysfunctional, where, it doesn't make sense that they're so dysfunctional, but at the same time, it makes all the sense in the world because they're deeply human.
We'll see how well I can do this over the course of the interview. My goal is to kind of zoom into specific ways that you have practiced these principles in your own life, specifically maybe related to the book launch, and then zoom out into tactics that anybody can apply for themselves. I think going broad first, just to get to know you a little bit, and because I'm curious very selfishly, where does your interest in the future of work originate? Right? How early in your life were you interested in how people come together, how they congregate, and how they work together?
So that aspect, the latter in terms of teamwork and collaboration very early. I was a competitive swimmer growing up, and even though swimming was a very individual sport, it was a team sport. And especially, I'm from Toronto originally. I came to California to compete for Stanford. It'd been my dream forever. And coming to that Division 1 swimming school was such a shock to the system for me in the
Hmm.
best possible way, because it was such a team first environment, even as an individual sport. And ever since then, in particular, I've been fascinated by, why is it that you can bring together a group of people in a way that the whole is greater than the sum of the individual parts? And if you can do that in athletics, in the pool or on a sports field, why can't you do that in an organization? And what would it take to do so? That's always been incredibly fascinating to me.
So fun that we both started with the physical. Right. For me, that was gymnastics and walking into a
Mm-hmm.
gymnastics gym at 17 after 10 years as a competitive runner and
Mm,
seeing the trust, seeing the protocol, seeing the both sides of it, right? What
yeah.
happens when people burned out? What happens when people get into, political catfights, especially as teenagers in organized sports, but also the
Mm,
camaraderie and
yeah.
the drive and the learning from each other that can happen. Do you have any specific stories, especially coming to Stanford, about what it like to apply that to your swimming career for us?
Oh, everything. I mean, from showing up, and if you weren't having a good day individually, like that was okay. It was team first. Coming on the deck, and we our coach Lee Maurer, who's now at USC, I believe. She was big in the sense of a happy swimmer is a fast swimmer, and you need to create that environment where people are happy and people are forming connections. So we would have, like, this was an intense, multiple world record holders on the team. The work was intense. But we came on deck and we often had story time around the hot tub, sharing those stories from, maybe it was Christmas break or maybe it was the weekend. And there was a real sense of, you know, elite performance didn't need to be the be all and end all. And you could do both. You could have a great supportive atmosphere and be ruthlessly competitive. And I think, ever since then at Asana, I worked at Asana before. One of our values was reject false trade offs. And I think that's something that I first recognized the importance of as a swimmer. Like, you can do two things well at once that might seem contradictory. And likewise in organizations, I'm a big proponent of happy workers are good workers. And, if you motivate people in the right way, you're going to be able to extract so much more value out of them and for them than maybe is conditioned into sort of the ethos of how we operate organizations. And I think, challenging the status quo, challenging these dichotomies that we often think are binary is really, really important.
Super fun. I don't particularly follow American football, but we're just a week after the Super Bowl, and I believe it's the former coach of the Patriots was known for being a complete jerk.
Mm.
And the Patriots were very, very successful despite or because of his ruthless style of coaching. And now there is a new coach who kind of came up under him who is deeply kind and very kind of Ted Lasso level enthusiasm. Um, yeah, I mean, I hear your preference for kindness. I share that as well. Any further reflections on that dichotomy? Because I think there is a, as you say, false dichotomy of false trade-offs. Maybe both work.
Yes, and I think resilience and adaptability is super important. And I don't think kindness is necessarily the be all and end all of how to extract the most value out of people. I think it's recognizing what motivates people. And for some, that's very much a more touchy-feely approach. But for others, and I was this way where I wanted people to push my buttons, and I still do in organizations. I want to be challenged. I want people to tell me when I haven't done a, stellar job on something. And I think it's really important, especially in athletics. And maybe even just as important in organizations, to figure out what motivates people. And regardless of what style of leader you are, how can you use that knowledge of motivation to create environments that extract the greatest value out of your people?
Mm-hmm. You've had to create a team in order to execute the book launch, and especially as successfully as you have. Tell me a little bit about the size of the team you've put together, what that's been like working with your publisher, and specifically, I'm going to go into like what has your meeting cadence been like? What has your work cadence been like to execute a very successful book launch?
It's been much more organic than I think it might seem on paper and through interactions. This was something that I didn't appreciate the full scope of what was involved from the get go. I wanted to write a book because I thought I had a perspective that was valuable and I wanted to help people, and I love writing. And as I got deeper into the process, I realized just what this means.
Right,
And
writing is one thing. Writing a book is
writing
another.
is such
Publishing is a completely different
yeah,
job.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I have a mentor at Stanford, Bob Sutton, who's just been life-changing for me in so many ways. And at every step, he guided me through the process in terms of, selecting that publisher, selecting an agent. I wasn't going to even work with an agent in the beginning. And I haven't always actually, this has been a shift in my career, but ever since, I'd say high school, I've believed that I am better if I surround myself with people who are better than me. And I wasn't always that way. I used to love to be, the big fish in the small pond. And,
Hmm.
over time, I've recognized I'd much rather be around people who are smarter than me and bring out the best of me, because I think my superpower is I work really hard, and I have a lot of confidence in that. And so that was the philosophy I took with the book launch. And the more and more I recognized, the different pieces that I would need to put together, the more I had the philosophy of I want the best. I want people who, and the best in the sense of people who believed in me and were going to go to bat for me. And at several instances, it was very clear to me that the people in the organizations that might look the best on paper weren't going to be the best for me in my campaign. And so finding those, I had lots and lots of conversations in particular around, the editors and the publicists, and really wanting to choose partners that believed in the book. And, a good sense of that is, are they willing to take the learnings and apply them to their own organizations? I thought was a really good benchmark. And Simon & Schuster was one where very early, it was clear they were going to implement these findings in their organization and take a vested interest in, the actual words on the page and not just the campaign. And so I started to, learn more and more, what are the questions I should be asking as I'm speaking with folks, and what's the bench of people that I want to put together.
There's an interesting mix, right? A lot of your best meeting ever is written from the place of you're asserting authority in, let's just say, this Zoom meeting, right? Where I'm coming in and I'm saying, hey, what's the agenda? Oh, if there's not an agenda, should we not have this meeting? Or
Mm-hmm.
who's responsible for leading this meeting, etc. But when you're sitting down with, in this case, Simon and Schuster, and you're saying, I've written a book, or I'm writing a book about how to structure meetings better and not waste your organization's time, but you're also coming in some ways as a new author, hat in hand, to say, and I mean, hopefully you had a bidding war for the book, et cetera, but nonetheless, right, you are coming to them and saying, you publish books. How do you recommend that other people, or if you want to use yourself as the example, show up with the authority and clarity of this is how to operate, but also the humility of want to work with me?
It's such an insightful question. So I mean, tactically, what I did at every stage of the campaign was I asked a ton of questions. I was nosy and asked every question in the book because I didn't know the answers and I didn't know which questions I should be asking. And I did that asynchronously. Every day I'm sending an email to, my agent, my editor, asking these questions that I didn't even know I should be asking, but why not? And then that enabled us to focus our meetings very strategically in, what are the things that are ambiguous that we need to work through synchronously in a meeting. I had very few meetings related to the campaigns. And probably that's one hidden benefit of writing a book on meetings is everyone around you shows up to meetings much more prepared and on time. And
Nice.
I feel pressured
Nice.
to do the same. So, I have a bi-weekly, every other week meeting with my team. Essentially, I maybe on average had a monthly meeting with my editor. Most of this was all asynchronous, and I think that's what it should be. It definitely wasn't a meeting heavy campaign, and I'm glad that that was the case.
Yep. Super cool. I'll give an example of one way that you did this really well with me. We were introduced by our mutual friend, David Shackelford, as a potential speaker for Responsive Conference. And I'm delighted that you're going to be coming on stage at Responsive 26 in September. During our first kind of get to know you, probably 20-minute call, because that tends to be my default. We'll get into default lengths in a minute. I mentioned that I like book marketing, like just as a side thought experiment. I think a lot about how to market books because I love books and enjoy marketing. Offered to spend, I think, 30 minutes with you if it was ever useful. You followed up, we scheduled time, and I just downloaded a ton of thoughts on all of the different strategies to sell books. You said thank you very much, and I didn't hear from you for 2 months. And I look at what you're doing to launch the book, and a lot of those strategies, which are not rocket science and not, I'm not the first person to think of them, have been implemented, right? Not claiming that you got those ideas from me. You probably had heard them from lots of people, but it was really exciting and impressive to see that simplicity of, yes, I want this thing. Yes, you have some expertise in this area, or at least excitement and passion and hard work in this area. Rebecca, I'm just going to take a lot of notes. And you were grateful, you were clear, you were professional, you asked lots of good questions. Then there was nothing else. And then you sold books in bulk. Then you were, selling speaking engagements assigned with books. Then you had benefits for buying, 3 books instead of just one. And what one of the things that you said, and we'll get into as well, sort of knowing oneself, which I think is an essential part of kind of any amount of work, but especially running effective meetings. The hard work that I have seen you do, right? It actually takes more hard work to go, schedule a meeting with this random guy you just met and take a lot of notes and then go implement them, right? That is the effective work. And as I read your best meeting ever, a lot of what came up was like, oh yeah, right. Your Seth Godin praise is, this book is great for people willing to do the work, right? Mm-hmm. It's like really quite easy for Robin to spitball a whole bunch of marketing ideas. It's another thing entirely. And I would say 100 to 1,000 times more difficult to go and execute them, right? Mm-hmm. And watching you execute was really an interesting example. I knew I would enjoy the book when I watched you execute on the marketing plan.
Thank you. That means a lot. And you helped a ton. And I took every piece of advice very seriously. And I definitely things I did were inspired by your advice for sure. And I'm really grateful for that.
Well, delighted to hear it. I don't think any of them are new. But anything that was useful, I'm delighted. Talk to me about self-knowledge and the role of an employee knowing themselves, or a leader kind of inviting employees to get to know themselves, right? Back to your swimming coach, right? I often tell my fiance and members of my family, like, I am motivated by carrots, not by sticks, right? Like, praise Robin and Robin will perform for you, right? Mm-hmm. I love notes, right? I'm a physical performer. I'm an athlete. Give me all the notes in the world. But if you want me to do well, give me praise. That takes a level of I've experienced all of it, right? I've took ballet for years where I would get hit by the ballet instructor with rulers on the knuckles, right? Very old school ballet. Doesn't really work for me.
Mhm.
Um, what is the role of self-knowledge and how do you help how have you selected colleagues, coworkers, even companies that embody that? Or how do you help people that work for you, for example, on the book launch, practice self-knowledge because it's such an
Mm.
important part of running effective meetings or working in general?
Yeah, it's such a big question and an important one. I think, tactically, what I've learned, first, self knowledge is absolutely important. There's nothing more important. And I think it ties back to motivation. The more you can know yourself, the more you know how you're going to be motivated, and the more you can then communicate that to others. Because I don't think a lot of people truly take the time, for sure, early in their career to understand that piece, to really take a step back and understand what motivates me, because often it's not monetary rewards. Often you're motivated by something that is much more intangible, whether that's praise, or sometimes it's criticism, or sometimes it's learning, or sometimes it's, collaboration with others. Everyone is different, and that changes over time too. And it certainly changes with the organizational context, because certain organizational context will offer that and some won't. And if they don't offer what is, innately motivating to you, that's sometimes okay, if you have a good sense of, what are those other tools that I know motivate me. So that's essential, and making it explicit, I think, is my biggest learning. As a manager, as an individual contributor, writing that down and codifying it and then being able to share it with others is super important. I think one of the best things a manager can do right now, in particular, as AI is, changing or pressure testing all of our roles, is understand, what what makes work meaningful and purposeful for you. I was giving a presentation earlier this week on the dangers of automating the soul of work, and this is something that I've talked a lot with Bob Sutton about. Is, we're seeing lots of evidence. There was a Stanford study that came out a little while back that found that 41% of AI startups within Y Combinator are automating things that people would prefer to keep human.
Yep.
And we're seeing that time and time again. Just because something can be automated, and maybe can be automated effectively, doesn't mean it should be automated. And if you don't understand what motivates your workers, it's easy to fall into that trap, and very dangerous to do so. So I think codifying it, understanding as a manager, certainly, having a document that, it's those user manuals of your employees are really, really important. How do they prefer to communicate? What motivates them? What are their career aspirations? We need to be able to codify and refer back to these documents as we attempt to lead our organizations, and especially lead our organizations through change.
Do you actually have employees that report to you or colleagues create user manuals?
I do. I do. I'm relatively new at Glean, so it's not something I've put into practice at Glean yet. But historically, yes, and it's every intention that that's one of the first things I do with a team is codify that.
Nice. Yeah. You started in AI, so we'll jump to that as at least a next stepping off stone. If there's kind of three eventualities with AI, one where nothing changes just for the sake of argument, one that is an abundance, a world of abundance, right? Where we get to do all of the things that we want to do with lots of spare time, and one where, I don't know, my grandchildren are dating robots, right? One
Mhm.
or the human race ceases to exist because we are controlled by robots. What's your personal outlook? And as an academic, as a researcher, what's your outlook on where the world is going as regards work and AI?
So it's so hard to make any sort of predictions with AI, and what we're starting to see is the people who are most confident in their predictions are the ones.
Selling something?
Yes, and it's, I think I can make a conjecture in terms of what we're likely to see in the next 6 months. And I think, unfortunately, in most organizations, AI, well, what we know is AI doesn't magically transform any part of our organization. It amplifies what's already in existence, whether that's better or worse. We're certainly seeing that with aspects of culture. We're seeing that with metrics. We're seeing that from a technology workflow perspective. If you've broken workflows, AI is not going to magically transform that. We're seeing an over index on investing in the technology over investing in people, and investing in the technology and treating it like a personal productivity tool over anything else. And I think because of that, we're going to continue to see productivity gains at the individual level and much less extensive gains at the team and organizational level. And that's unfortunate because we know this technology can be used in incredibly powerful ways to improve how we collaborate and how we work together and collaborate cross-functionally, certainly, especially with agents. But we're not seeing that because we're not seeing enough organizations recognize how important the change management around AI is, and that human focus. There's a world in which AI can make all of our lives better and more abundant, and healthier work-life balances. The evidence does not point to that future for this foreseeable future, in my view. But I think the potential is there, which is really exciting. And we're starting to see organizations be really thoughtful. They're in the minority and they're rare, but you're starting to see snapshots of a very exciting future potential associated with the technology, where the technology amplifies humanity and not the reverse. I'm not convinced that's going to be the reality.
Yeah, I'm in my life relentlessly optimistic, right? Optimistic as a chosen stubborn stance more than anything else. And I know a lot of people who have already been laid off in the last year due to their job being essentially negated because of AI. A year, I do not make predictions as a rule. And a year ago, if we had talked about it, I would have said, yeah, I think, something like 70% of Xander Media's income, of my day job income, comes from video production. There is a lot of ability to make great video. And that has not come true in the last 12 months. What that will be 36 months from now, right? I wouldn't dare to predict. So another thing that I hear you saying, kind of the subtext, is shorten the time horizon, right? You're saying, well, 6 months I'm willing to speak to, right? If we had talked 10 years ago, I'm guessing that 6 months would have been a slightly longer time horizon.
Yes, absolutely. And we're seeing that the best leaders right now are also recognizing that, they're setting thresholds either explicitly or implicitly in terms of recognizing just how many pilots and POCs ought to fail. This is a technology where if we're doing it correctly, if we're implementing it correctly, failure needs to be a big part of the process. And because of that, thinking in terms of shorter time horizons really does make a whole lot of sense.
Yep. One of the early stories that I have around collaboration and my interest in the future of work, I grew up in my dad's small business. He and his sister ran an environmental consulting engineering firm for 30 years. So I was a paper pusher. I was filing papers in metal filing drawers when I was 7. And then I think I was probably 14, I studied abroad in Costa Rica for a year, in Monteverde, which is a cloud forest that is a historically Quaker community. And I went to a Quaker school. And the Quaker tradition has these weekly meetings where the community gathers and by full consensus makes decisions. So every Sunday I found myself required, as part of participation in the community and the school, sitting in these Quaker circles. And one specific meeting was a debate between single and double ply toilet paper for the school. And the other option that Robin could be doing was literally climbing trees and climbing to the canopy and swinging on vines through the rainforest, right? That's how I spent most of my time. And I was instead listening to people debate single versus double ply toilet paper. And I just remember, like, I don't care. I opt out, right? This 14-year-old doesn't want to say, please let me leave. And so that was another component of collaboration and of my own desire to make work suck less as I read your book.
Mm-hmm. And that's, so much of that is based on our tribal instincts as humans. We feel like we are part of a tribe, and meetings often fuel that tribal mentality where we feel like we need to show up regardless of whether the meeting is meaningful. And that's why, leadership is a big part of the book, how important it is for leaders to give employees, give workers explicit permission to leave the meeting and do as much asynchronously. It's all about designing the meeting to counteract these very human tendencies, whether they're implicit or explicit, in terms of showing up just to show up rather than thinking very carefully about what actually needs to happen in this meeting to move work forward and who needs to be involved.
I am just chuckling to myself because it strikes me as such a power move to write a book that you are both managing employees and also you're not the CEO of your organization. So in some ways you have people that you report to, and you can just kind of like hold up the book if there's like a bad meeting or if structures are broken. What other advice would you give to people, maybe middle management internal to organizations, or employee number 15 of a 50-person startup, to to have that power, to have to raise their hand and say, hey, I think that the way that this system has always worked could be different, right? Or the advice that you'd give to Robin at 14 to say, like, hey, those of us who don't care about the details of janitorial for this building, can we leave?
Mm-hmm.
How do you teach that, short of writing a book on the topic and waving it in front of the noses of the people who aren't listening to you?
I wish there were a silver bullet for this question, because I get asked it a lot. And what we know is it's so dependent on the level of psychological safety, in particular within the organization. In some organizations, and fortunately, as a result of this book, I've had an opportunity to interact with many of them, where there's a wide recognition that meetings suck, and there's a willingness and desire to fix them. And so you'll send an email promoting the book, and they're like, yes, we've been waiting for this. We know that this, and sometimes it comes at all levels. Sometimes it comes from the C-suite, sometimes it comes from the HR leader, where they know they have the autonomy to suggest changes intentionally. They just don't know how to do it. And so fortunately, I think that's the case in many organizations. In some organizations, it's not. And that's why in the book, I talk about, the importance of leading with curiosity and leading with metrics, and hopefully objective metrics. So not necessarily calling out the bad meeting or the person running the bad meeting, but leading with curiosity in terms of, hey, I don't think I'm going to contribute to this discussion on toilet paper. What if I were to sit out? Leading with curiosity as opposed to the assumptions. And then increasingly, I'm seeing people use technology to help deflect the blame or the perceived blame. So putting in checks and balances to say, if this meeting doesn't have an agenda and it should have an agenda, or if half the participants haven't accepted the meeting invite 24 hours in advance, we're going to auto cancel. That's one of the most effective strategies I found for these environments of low psychological safety, because the burden is placed on the technology rather than the human. And that's why, again, codifying some of these best practices and principles around meetings can be very effective, because if employees can point to the rule that says, what deserves to be a meeting in our organization, it gives them much more ammunition and confidence to push back and say, hey, this doesn't pass in the book, I use the 4D rule. This is why I'm going to opt out, as opposed to I'm going to opt out because I'm going to opt out, because then it gets interpreted as a personal attack. People take it very personally when you opt out of the meeting or don't show up. And so the more we can use technology and objective metrics, the more we can measure our meeting effectiveness and use that as a bar to decide whether the meeting deserves to stay on the calendar. I think that's the best bet for these more psychologically unsafe environments.
Just briefly, for folks who haven't read the book yet, What is that rule?
So the 4D CEO test is a two-part test to decide whether a meeting should deserve to exist. And regardless of whether you use this test, every organization should be able to point very clearly to a rule in terms of what deserves to be a meeting. If you were to ask 5 of your employees what deserves to be a meeting on this team in this organization, you should get one answer. And it's such a simple thing for organizations to implement. So the first part of the test is the 4D test. A meeting should only exist if the purpose is to decide, discuss, debate, or develop yourself or your team. Even if it passes that first test, it needs to pass the CEO test, meaning the content of the meeting either needs to be complex, so there needs to be enough ambiguity, right? If we're deciding on toilet paper, that's not a ambiguous, complex decision. E, is it emotionally intense? So if we're needing to manage emotions, read emotions, if we're delivering harsh feedback or trying to persuade someone, we know body language is important and that often justifies a meeting. And then O comes from Amazon. Is it a one-way door decision? Meaning once we walk through the door,
Is it
it's
reversible?
exactly, because the cost of misalignment is so high that you probably want to get in a room for 15 minutes and make sure everyone's aligned fully. Most of our decisions in organizations are two-way doors, meaning they're quite easy to reverse. Like
Yep.
toilet paper is, you can swap out the toilet paper to a different ply
I love
model
that this
the
has
next
become the
week.
reference point. Um, so the other thing that you said is, and you say it throughout the book, is the automation of, right? And let's just take Xander Media, right? A sub 10 person team uh, running my conferences and particularly the narrative strategy and video production that we do. I don't have the tech stack to do that. What do you recommend? What are the tools to automate meetings, right? We use
Mhm.
Calendly, we use Google Suite, of course. We'll get into meeting length a little bit later, but like, how do you automatically remove meetings that don't have more than 50% of attendees mark themselves as attending within 24 hours before the meeting?
So a lot of these organizations will use scripts and APIs, and even organizations that are now doing this through just a Google Calendar. It definitely doesn't. These sort of gatekeepers or roadblocks, speed bumps, I sometimes call them, those can be implemented very effectively with traditional meeting software. Where we get into, and there's a whole chapter in the book on metrics and some of these new creative ways to start to measure meeting effectiveness in terms of your charisma or engagement levels or multitasking within the meeting, although that's now in Teams, you can get a sense of that. Those often require these new shiny AI tools, but a lot of these checks and balances can happen, and certainly scheduling. I do work with Doodle, and all of these organizations have made it much easier to well, not all, some have made it much easier to automate the scheduling process, which we know is often the hardest part of the process. The problem that we're seeing with AI in particular is, just as we're seeing more broadly, it's very easy for you to develop a scheduling type platform in a way that's highly optimized for the user as opposed to the recipient. And
Yep.
so I think it's very important also to think about, okay, as you're automating the scheduling for yourself, what level of friction does that then dump on other people? And as an organization, think about that team and organizational level, not just the individual productivity. Transcription is another great example where I'm not a fan of, in general, AI bots taking notes in meetings where they physically show up and distract the attendees, but I am a
Yep.
fan of, using transcription where it makes sense and everyone's consented, to help streamline the note taking process, make that asynchronous communication after the meeting and before the next meeting much more effective, and free up the cognitive capacity to truly engage in the meeting.
I one of the things that I took away reading the book was how can I make seamless the process of feedback? And I'll give sort of
Mhm.
two different examples. One, I led a webinar last week for about 100 people for a community of product leads called Sidebar. And at the end, the host put up a screen that was just a URL, a bit.ly for giving feedback on the session. And it was before the final closing remarks. It was up for like 5 minutes. It was just a sub part of the screen. And it was really elegantly done as, we want your feedback. We want to improve on this. Please answer it'll take 3 seconds. Do it while you're on this call. And just the idea of like, what if the closing screen of every single meeting was rate this meeting, right? Which ultimately you do once and it's up forever, right? And there's probably a way to automate that even within Zoom software. The other version of that, which is a nice idea, but I don't think works, is hotel bathrooms with the like smiley face or the frowny face that you're supposed to hit on your way out of the bathroom, which have always felt a little bit ick to me. Like, I don't think I've ever actually touched those. I like the idea of asking for feedback, but you've got to do it in a way that is seamless to people's experience and baked into the process with enough context that people feel comfortable responding.
Exactly. And in your best meeting ever, I recommend what I learned from my colleague Elise Keith is, called ROTI, return on time investment. It's a 0 to 5 scale that I recommend you ask after 10% of the meetings you organize. Was this meeting worth the time you invested? And as a follow up, what could I do as the organizer to boost this rating by 1 point? Gives you such important information. I don't think you need to ask after every meeting, but certainly you should be asking attendees, not rating them yourselves, asking the users of the meeting to rate not how effective the meeting was this meeting worth the time you invested? Because unlike meetings, which we know we're socially conditioned to hate and see as negative, time is something that we all have an intuitive sense of the value of. And it helps to remove some of those biases and gives you such helpful information in terms of, is this meeting deserving to be on the calendar? And usually what you see is split ratings. So you see a cohort rate the meetings as a 5 and a cohort rate the meetings as a 2 to 3. And probably, the 2 to 3 ratings are the ones where you need to reconfigure either the agenda or the attendee list so that, you're getting those well invested meetings on the calendar at a much higher frequency.
And as you say that, I can imagine just creating a snippet, like an automated sequence in Superhuman, my mail provider,
Totally.
to automatically, like, it'll take me 2 strokes of a button to send that follow-up survey to attendees at random 3 times a week based on whatever meetings I've had.
Yeah, yeah. And even, there are lots of ways to do it. A form, a Google form, and Asana task, you ideally want it to be anonymous so people aren't, incentivized to give rosy
Praise
meeting
to
ratings.
praise Robin.
But it's something absolutely simple. You can even have them write on a piece of paper, and just use it. There's no excuse for not doing this, given how expensive these meetings are.
Back to your book launch, Paul Graham wrote a famous essay. Y Combinator's co-founder wrote an essay ages ago now on maker versus manager schedule. And I'd be curious to hear you reflect on the process of writing and publishing and marketing your book. Where do you fall on that, right? How has it been balancing managing a team, coordinating a team to make, I mean, even scheduling this podcast, right, with your assistant or with somebody on your team is the person who's on the calendar invite, not you, right? So like there are clearly people involved in the process, and yet doing the deep work of not just writing physically, which we'll talk about, but also you've done a really excellent job, and you've done it even in this podcast, giving credit to different people whose work you are pulling from. So what is your relationship to making versus managing?
So in terms of the book launch, 95% making, to be honest. I just have such a great team that is doing the managing where I'm not spending time doing the coordination work. Almost all of my effort has been writing and, as we get closer to publication, being incredibly scrappy and hustling to get those, book orders and book sales. I would devote hours each day to reaching out to folks. And I'm a big believer in giving, and giving without the expectation of reciprocating. And I think that has really worked in my favor for this book launch, because fortunately I've had so many people, it's been a matter of outreaching and then people willing to, help out and, bring this knowledge to their organizations. It's been very little coordination work. Honestly, the biggest the most difficult part of this whole thing in terms of coordination and managing has been, I have a full-time job that is very important to me, that is, my priority. And how do I balance the two in terms of the book, which is much more maker, and then my day job, which because I wrote most of this when I was at Asana, and that was, I was managing a full team and needing to make those conflicting but also synergistic priorities work.
How did you do that when you were at Asana and you were writing? Like, what was your writing schedule?
I needed to be super disciplined, and I needed to go back to my swimming days where, I swam before classes and swam after classes. And even through this promotion, I tried to do everything possible I could do before 9 a.m. And fortunately, a lot of folks are on, the East Coast in terms of these podcasts and media. So that worked. But I would carve out 2 or 3 hours every morning early. I'm not a morning person, so I needed to, get used to that. And then late at night, having writing sessions, and the weekends were all book. And it was I definitely had to prioritize things and recognize that for these 2 years, these were my two big priorities. And probably I would need to, let up on the fun, let up on the life to make these two things that were really important work, along with family, which is, the third thing that's super important to me.
Yeah. I have a curiosity, both in terms of your preference and if you have any advice for Xandr Media or organizations in general, about organizations that are primarily spoken versus primarily written. So Amazon has the famous or infamous sort of 6-pagers, right? Where before every meeting, it doesn't matter who's in the meeting, everyone sits down and spends 15 minutes reading 6 pages of detailed memo about the thing that the meeting is there to discuss. And mea culpa at Xandr Media, right? I will routinely phone a colleague, right? It's like, oh, let's just have a 3-second conversation about that. Could be a Slack message, it could be an email, but instead we just phone each other, right? And it is very phone friendly and very quick meeting sync, if we can, right, sort of abstract it in that way. Do you have recommendations for organizations as to one way, in your opinion and in your research, is better than the other?
So, and as a researcher, the answer is always, it depends. And I think this is a perfect example of that. A written communication culture is so essential, regardless of what type of organization you work in, because a strong written communication culture enables you to have a strong verbal communication culture. Now, written communication is much more important the more distributed an organization is, because you're needing to rely more on the virtual communication, and that clarity of writing is incredibly important. But it's important for everyone, and it's a muscle that not many organizations actively try to hone and instill in their workers in a way that I think is a big missed opportunity. And it's becoming even more important with AI, because the more you can document things clearly and the more you can articulate well, not only does that enable AI to extract better insights, but it also enables you to resist this temptation to over index on too much content and too much AI slop, and really understand, okay, the art of written communication as both art and science, and more is not always better. I think it's becoming even more important. And then the other final piece that I think is very important is, we know that every organization has employees with very different learning styles, and inevitably, even if you are a small organization that's physically co-located, you are going to have employees that are introverted and have different learning styles. And because of that, we need to be developing both the verbal and written communication systems.
How much did you use AI in support of writing the book in terms of the process of writing, right? AI LLMs are so good at generating content, not speaking as a writer, good content per se, right? But at just creating content, creating mass. So what has your relationship with AI been in the process of writing the book?
So, and I write a ton, generally, and I'm a big believer, and I think we're starting to see the data to support this, that you need to figure out what is your unique human craft and your unique human skill that you bring to the table. For me, that's writing. I'm a innately written communicator, and for me, that process of first draft, revision, editing, it needs to be human first and human led and human exclusive in many cases. And that was my philosophy for the book. Now, for all the promotion, looking up the bookstagrammers and the influencers and figuring out time changes and all of these things that AI is also really good for, I absolutely leveraged for that type of coordination work and the research, what news articles have come out in the last week that maybe I could have a unique perspective on. But in terms of the writing, I've, from day one, believe that should be a deeply human pursuit.
It felt deeply human to me, right? And I'll just give you two lines that I underscored. This was on a single page. Another hour gone, swallowed whole by a slow motion time heist, right? Is just such a wonderful human metaphor that, I could spend half an hour with AI and generate that. And it just so felt like you. It felt like human language.
Oh, thank you.
Or
I can recite almost every sentence if you give me, the first two words, I think, because I did toil over every single word. And if for those folks who read both the galley and the final copy, there was quite a significant shift because after I had submitted the galley, which would have been 18 months ago, to the final locked version, I did go through every single word and tweak. And, it was every word on the page where I thought carefully about, is this the right word to use? And I'm proud of that. I'm proud of that. I think it's a well-written book in addition to, hopefully offering some practical advice.
um, built hierarchies so steep they could give you vertigo.
Vertigo. Yeah,
Uh,
all of these, I went back and forth, and there's so many ways you can craft a sentence. And I love that. I love the magic. That's something that AI is never going to, at least in the, 6 months, it's
yeah,
not going
for
to,
sure.
it's not going to, that joy of crafting and tinkering is something that I think is very, very human.
Executives are drowning in calendar carnage.
Mhm.
I'll stop there, but it was so fun to find those and just grin. I read a lot of books now, so I've really made a study, a practice of writing as a discipline for myself in the last 2.5 years, writing a weekly newsletter. It's been a craft that I have very deliberately wanted to cultivate. And so I'll go read particularly business books, right, written by executives who are maybe not authors first, writers first. And they can be well written, but they don't make me grin. They don't read like West with the Night or Anne Lamont's Bird by Bird. They don't feel delightful. They just get the point across. And there were so many moments through yours that felt delightful. So I just want to compliment you on that.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Um, what is the future of writing with AI, right? Past
Mm.
that 6 month mark, is it going to matter that you and I enjoy those turns of phrase?
Gosh, I hope so. I hope so, and I think so. I think we're starting to see, the pendulum shift back slightly to give us optimism in terms of the importance of physical relationships, physical experiences. And I think writing and certainly oral communication is something, if I had to pick one thing, for my career where I think it's relatively future proof in terms of disruption with AI, it's that oral communication. And you need to be in my opinion, a strong written communicator to be a strong oral communicator. So I don't think AI is touching that anytime soon, but inevitably we're seeing it certainly on social media platforms and in other places too, where the words are becoming more and more similar and more dry, even as they become more and more polished and less replete with typos. And I think as a result of that, and I hope the really strong written communicators are going to stand out. And we're starting to see that as well with some of these, massive salaries being offered for, executive communicators and storytellers within organizations. It's not a coincidence that that's happening part and parcel with the rise of AI.
I mean, you're talking my book, so thank you very much. As somebody who organizes events, I see resilience there in a way
Mm-hmm.
that I don't in, for example, a lot of app development or SaaS software, right? That when people gather at Responsive Conference or my upcoming Snafu conference, there is a value of people gathering in person. And then
Mm-hmm.
similarly, despite Xander Media doing a lot of video, the utility of storytelling, right? I know professional speakers who are incredible at speaking despite not being writers. For
Mm-hmm.
me, as you articulated it, I have to write clearly in order to speak clearly. That's just part of my process. The other
Mm-hmm.
thing that I'll say in just my own personal book view of books is there's a little bit of kind of a rebel alliance desire in the human race is only going to make it if we can reclaim our attention.
Mm-hmm.
And reading is one of the ways, as is exercise, where you are, right? I mean, you can't swim while watching a screen, right? I
Mm-hmm.
can't do gymnastics while watching a screen. And reading books is another that is a way to reclaim human attention, which I think is pivotal for truly, like the way I feel it is the existential survival of the human race in the next
Mm-hmm.
several generations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree.
If you could briefly, and we're almost out of time, so I want to be respectful. You've already been very generous with us. Go through your tech stack. Like what personally or to manage book launch, what tools do you use? And are there any that are particularly surprising to run effective meetings or run work effectively?
Mm. So I mean, email is unfortunately, most of it in terms of, but I am very strategic. I think it's more, and I actually ran this fascinating study with my co-authors during my PhD where we looked at how did technology change through the pandemic. And what we actually found was the technology actually didn't change that much, but how people enacted it changed a lot. And I think despite working in tech and loving technology, I think we put too much focus on the actual tools and not how we enact them in practice. And I think that enactment is more important. So, in terms of email, for example, yes, I use email heavily, but whenever possible, I'll chunk and batch my emails. And even, in the last 2 weeks where I knew I would have things coming into my inbox that had various levels of urgency and importance. The radio call tomorrow, I needed to be on the watch for. I couldn't just check my email once a day, but being very good at filtering and picking out, okay, this is something I need to respond to right now versus everything else I'm going to block out an hour at night to batch and do. That's an important part. I'm a big big believer that for me, my writing improves drastically when I write on different surfaces. And
Hmm.
so throughout the book launch, the book writing process, I would gravitate and rotate amongst different platforms. So I would start, for example, in Google Docs, then I would print out a physical copy. Then sometimes I do it in an email message just because I do believe looking at the words in a different way. Sometimes I'm a big um, believer in changing the font and changing the color. And so, changing to a blue font to activate different senses and sort of inject that creative spirit in a way that often dulls as you look at, black text on a Google Doc. So that was a key part of my process. Beyond that, Asana I use, for time management, both professionally and personally to some extent. I've started using Doodle for calendar scheduling, which has been helpful. That's Zoom for most meetings, but other than that, there's nothing out of the ordinary, I would say, about my tech stack.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's some really interesting studies. I've never changed the text color of a document I'm writing in, but the physical location. So if you
Yeah.
are writing in a cathedral with giant awe-inspiring ceilings, you are much more likely to have big
Yes.
picture ideas. And if you're writing in a closed box, that's much better for editing and for kind of narrowing down and cleaning up copy. So
Yes.
I like this writing in an email provider versus writing in a Google Doc versus writing by hand as another example of the same.
And the physical location too. You can give me any chapter and I'll be able to remember the Uber I was in, or the, plane I was on, or the city I was in, or the cafe where I had the big breakthrough in terms of that framework for the chapter. I'm a big believer in that, like, physical connectivity to the words.
Well, we've talked enormously about all different facets, big picture and very minute detail around work. As a parting question, what are some non-work related books that you have gifted or that you often recommend to other people? Books not
Oh.
related to organizational structure or meetings.
Oh, this is not my ball game, because I do think that all business books have implications beyond business, and I'm just such a lover of the science of, organizational design, where, I can take a book like Adam Grant's Give and Take, for example, and I would argue that's a business book, but has profound implications for how I certainly think about relationships and broader aspects of my life than just work. So I'd be hard pressed to, Bob Sutton's books I love, but all of those, scaling up excellence in terms of, how do you do that within business? But certainly there are direct parallels that I've drawn significantly. Cialdini's Influence is one book that has
Brilliant.
significantly influenced my, not just how I show up as a professional, but certainly how I navigate the personal terrain as well.
Great. We'll
I don't
take
think I
those
have a
three.
great
No,
answer.
100%. Yeah. Rebecca, thank you very much for spending the time. For folks listening and watching, where can they go to learn more about you, about your work, and the book?
So the book is at all your favorite bookstores, and my website's RebeccaHinds.com, and I'm on LinkedIn as well.
Great. It is no surprise to me that the book has already been received as warmly as it has. Congratulations again, but it's really due to the hard work that you have clearly poured into making this book excellent. So, as Seth Godin said to me when I published Responsive: What It Takes to Create a Thriving Organization, thank you for your book.
Thank you. Thank you for this conversation too. It's been fun.
Very much a pleasure. Hey, it's Robin again. One quick thing before you go, and that is the Snafu newsletter. Would you like to receive from me every Saturday a free newsletter with an article that I've written about influence and persuasion, along with 3 quick things, 3 bullet points of cool tools, tactics, quotes, or books that I've discovered from throughout the week? You can sign up at robinpzander.com. Just click join the newsletter. It's free, comes out each Saturday. And with that, I hope you enjoyed this wide-ranging conversation with Rebecca Hinds, and I'll see you next time.